Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Git By Example series. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, be sure to check out the playlist linked right up here to get caught up, and be sure to get subscribed to me so you don't miss any of the future videos in the series. So now that we have a good idea of how to actually track files and commit them, we're going to take some time to talk about ignoring files. So when we ignore a file, Git is not going to stage it or include it in our repository, regardless of what changes are made to it, and regardless of if its path is included in a staging command like git add. So this is extremely useful for a whole range of things, including package files and dependencies that can just be re-downloaded later. For example, your node modules folder in a Node.js project, or like different gem files for different dependencies in a Ruby project, or anything else like that. And it's also crucial for keeping secrets in your code safe. So let's say you have like an API key or some other sort of credential in your code and you need to keep it private. The best way to do that is going to be to put it into a separate credential file and then gitignore that file. Because if it does end up in your Git repository and you push it publicly somewhere, then that's essentially just handing out your credentials, which is very, very bad. So to ignore files, we are going to go ahead and add patterns that reference them into a file called .gitignore. So we can just go ahead and open up that file, create it and open it up rather. And if we go ahead and save here and run git status, you will see that now it is an untracked file that we're going to want to add to our next commit. So now is when we're going to get into actually writing our gitignore file. So I highly recommend you check out my dev environment video for a super useful VS Code extension right here, which you will see me demonstrate right here. So if we use add gitignore, then you'll see it gives me a list of a bunch of different languages and technologies. And from there, I can just click on one of these and it will add a bunch of different stuff here. So let's say I wanted to add all of the Node stuff in, then you'll see this is going to add a bunch of stuff for Node.js. So I highly recommend that extension, which you will see linked in my dev environment video. And then that is built off of a tool called the GitHub Gitignore repo, which just is a repository with a bunch of Gitignore templates. So once you have a template like that, then you can go ahead and still add your own Gitignore files on top of them. And also, if you're doing a super basic project, you might just need a few files gitignored. So we're going to talk about the syntax of how a gitignore file works right here. So as I mentioned before, Git just uses different patterns that will match different things. So if we just have a bare string here, then it's going to match any file or folder with that name. So let's say we want to ignore a file called ignore me. So now if we were to jump on over here and create a file called ignore me, then we go ahead and ls, and we'll see that ignore me is listed there. But if we git status, you'll see that it is only seeing .gitignore. I'll make that clear for you. It is only seeing our .gitignore file as something that it wants to go ahead and try to add to our next commit. Because once our gitignore gets added to our repository, it's going to ignore every single file that is named ignore me, so ignore me is not going to get added. So this will also work for directories. So if I had a directory called ignore me instead, then it would ignore that. And that is it for bare strings. So other than that, the next thing to note is exclamation points. So an exclamation point at the start of a line negates that pattern. So if I then added exclamation point ignore me and we ran git status again here, then now you would see, okay, well, this pattern right here just got negated right here. So now it is going to get added in the next thing. So since gitignore files are read top to bottom, this will need to be placed after it's previously ignored. And the thing to note here is obviously this is not a situation you're going to want to do where you ignore a file and then explicitly re-add it back in later. That doesn't make any sense. But what this is useful for is if you ignore every single file in a directory somewhere earlier in your thing, then you can go ahead and re-include specific files in that directory later using this syntax right here. So the next piece of syntax we're going to discuss, now that we have that tackled, is going to be the slash. So a slash is a directory separator, and it can be used in a bunch of different ways. So if a slash is used at the start or in the middle of a string, then it's only going to match paths that are on the same directory level as your gitignore file. So let's say we wanted to ignore the data folder inside of our project. So we could have slash data right here. And then if we go ahead and mkdir data, and then we're also going to have to put content in there because Git is not going to track folders unless they actually have a file in them. So we can just go ahead and touch data/test, for instance. Then if we go ahead and git status, then you're going to see that, when you do that, you're going to have to explicitly mark it as a folder as well. So now if we go ahead and run git status, you will see this is going to ignore data. But with this pattern right here, if data was somewhere else in it, if like data was inside of another folder, so let's say if we like mkdir test and then we mv, data to test/data, then if we go ahead and git status now, then you're going to see that test is in fact going to be included, and inside of test, the data folder is in fact going to be included. Because using the slash at the start of the line means it has to be on the same level as that. Sorry about that. So now that we understand that, we can move on to the other uses of slash, which is going to be if it is at the end of a line. So at the end of the line, which you see right here as well, is just going to indicate that this is only going to match directories. So now if we go ahead and touch data, so if we just create a file called data and then we run git status, you're going to see that data is in fact going to be included here, because this is, since we have a slash at the end of this line right here, this is only going to ignore folders called data. So now we understand how slash works. So there are also some regular expression like wildcard notations that you can use. For example, an asterisk, which represents a clean star in regular expressions, can be used to match anything inside of a string. So let's say I wanted to match anything that was A and then any number of characters and then B, and I wanted to ignore those. So now if I go ahead and touch AB, and we run git status, you're going to see that's not going to get added. I can also touch this B and run git status again, and you're going to see that that's also not going to get added, and so on like that. So that will match anything like that. So now we can move on and talk about question marks, which are another things that are similar to regular expressions. So let's say I want to match C and then any single character, which is what a question mark represents, and then D. So now if I am to go ahead and touch CVD, for instance, then you see here that number didn't get updated. That's a quick shortcut because I have a git status thing on my terminal, on my command prompt. But if I were to touch CVVD, then... no, I do not want to do that. Then it's going to go ahead and add that anyway, because here CVV is not a single character. So the final thing that you can do is you can do regular expression ranges. So let's say I wanted to also match any file that starts with E and then has any uppercase letter between A and C, and then has a F at the end. So if we go ahead and do this, I'm aware this is getting more and more convoluted. So now if we have EA, or if we touch EAF, then that's not going to get added to our git status because that is ignored. But if we touch E2F, for instance, then that is going to get added. As you saw, that number just went up to 6. So the final piece of syntax we're going to tackle is the double asterisk here. So those can be used at the start of a pattern to match within all directories. So if you remember right here, if we are ignoring something with a file structure in it, so if we we want to ignore anything that's in like test/test, or something like that. Since we have a directory separator in the middle, this is only going to match things that are on the top level next to our Gitignore file. So if we were to put a double asterisk at the start of this, then this is going to match inside of all directories instead. So now anywhere where there's a folder called test that has something called test inside of it, that test thing is going to get ignored. I know that's a little difficult to follow, but just bear with me. And then the other options is it can be used in the middle of a string, and that will match any number of directories. So then if we had like dir1, and then we wanted to use /*/ then what that is going to do is then we can do dir_n, and this will match any sort of thing right here. So anything named dir_n that is inside of a folder called dir1 with any number of directories in between it. So that'll match like dir1/dir_n, but also it'll match dir1/dir2/dir_n and dir1/dir2/dir3/dir_n and anything like that. And finally, it can be used at the end of a line to match everything inside of a directory. So let's say we had a folder called like test folder or something like that, and we wanted to ignore everything inside of it. So then we could do that. And then the reason why you would use this instead of just ignoring the whole folder is if you then wanted to do something where you negate. So then we could do test folder /include me. So now this these two lines right here would ignore everything inside of test folder except for the include me file. So you can go ahead and play around with this on your own. There's a lot to learn here, but we're going to now move on to another important gitignore thing, which is actually not related at all to our gitignore file in our project repository. So now that we have tackled how your actual project Gitignore file is going to look, we're going to move on and talk about global Gitignores. So there are a few kinds of things that you're not going to want to include in your specific project related Gitignores, but you do want to exclude from every single Git project you make. So that's going to be things that are operating system specific. So like if you're on a Mac, then those .ds store files that show up everywhere, or like VS Events D, which also shows up everywhere in pretty much every directory. Or if you use VS Code as an editor, then the .vs code directory. And things like that. So instead of putting those ignored files inside of your project's gitignore file, they should instead be added to the gitignore file that you configure globally for your user. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that right now. To do that, we're going to configure a global gitignore file for our machine by creating a .gitignore file somewhere on our computer. I just put it in my home directory because I determined that was the thing that made the most sense. So then we can go ahead and take a look at mine. If we code ~/gitignore, that's going to open it up, and you'll see here that I have things that I just grabbed from templates for both macOS and for VS Code. So once you have this file written, you should include whatever you use for your different editors and for your operating system. Then you can just run git config -- global core.excludes file, and then the actual path to it, which is going to just be ~/.gitignore. I'm just going to do this here to make it a little bit easier to see, because sometimes slashes can be weird. And then Git will start globally ignoring all of the patterns that you put in that folder, file rather, in every single project that you do. So now we have a good idea of how to ignore files, both in our repository and globally, so we are ready to talk about how our actual repository works when it comes to viewing its history and dealing with all of that sort of stuff. So to end off today, what we can just go ahead and do is, remember, we have all of these files that we just added here, and you know what, I'm just going to add them in our commit here, and we'll say add gitignore and ignore examples. So this is just going to be a commit. Oh, I forgot to add everything. So right, we have to go ahead and do that, and then we can go ahead and run our commit right here, and this is adding our gitignore and all of the files that were not ignored by our gitignore, but were still created in our directory. So now that we understand that, tomorrow we're going to talk about our actual history and tracking your project as it goes through, which is very exciting, and after that we're going to be getting into actual remotes like GitHub, and then branching, and then very specific like power user GitHub stuff. So I'm very excited for all of that. I hope you guys are too. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of those videos, and leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.